Hi everyone, welcome to part 2. Okay, so along with prophylaxis, the idea of the general mobility of a pawn mass is one of the most important elements of Nimzowicz's teachings on positional play. It was his feeling that in the long run, the positional struggle comes down to a struggle between mobility on one side and restraining ability on the other. In such a struggle, prophylaxis is only a means to an end, i.e. to prevent the pawn mass from advancing. It's of the utmost importance that we strive for mobility of a given pawn mass in our play, because such a mass can have a crushing effect on our opponent when it advances. We shouldn't be worried if such a pawn roller comes at the expense of a backward pawn that will be left behind. On the contrary, such pawns can serve a nursing purpose to the rest of the chain. Thus it's important to take on board the idea of the generally mobile pawn mass and recognize that it's not crucial that every single pawn should be mobile. For example, let's take a look at the position before us here. Generally, white would like to play d4 at some point in order to liquidate his weak d2 pawn, which is backward on an open file. In fact, this position was reached by Nimzowitsch in a game against a professor called Michel, played in 1926. Instead of d4, Nimzowitsch played the more correct f4, and his reasons for doing so are along the lines of what was just being considered. Play continued queen e7, e4, bishop c6, now g4, and we can see that the general mobility of the pawn mass is enough, and the d2 pawn being backward isn't an issue. White went on to win easily after f5, which is a blunder. Presumably Michel wanted to clarify the pawn structure, as the flexibility makes defending much harder, but this is the kind of premature advance that such pressure hopes to achieve. After g takes f5, e takes f5 came e5 and bishop c7, now knight d5. Bishop takes d5 is forced. Black can't afford to lose his dark square bishop. C takes d5, queen e7, now e6, and black resigned. If queen takes d5, queen h6, and forced mate. So his position is just hopeless here. The next example comes from a game that Nimzowitsch played against the legendary Rubinstein at Dresden in 1926. It went as follows: c4, c5, knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, d5, c takes d5, knight takes d5, e4, and this creates a backward pawn on d2. So knight b4, now bishop c4, e6, castles, knight 8 c6. Nimzowitsch points out at this stage that if instead, for example, a6, he would have been in no hurry to liquidate the weak pawn. For example, if d4, c takes d4, queen takes d4, takes, bishop c5, bishop e3, bishop takes d4, bishop takes d4. Now comes knight c2. So forking the bishop and the rook. So rook a1, knight takes, rook takes. Now knight c6. So rook d2, now b5. And after bishop b7 and king e7, black is equalized. So we have to take care and have patience and make sure, you know, that we don't rush into an attack, and you know, and also that we don't liquidate backward pawns just because we see the opportunity to do so. You know, it's like in this example, it wasn't sound to do so. It allows black to equalize. So knight 8 c6, and now d3 is what Nimzowitsch played. So now the threat is a3, which is gonna get messy for black. So knight d4. So knight takes d4, c takes d4, now knight e2. And the point is that white can follow up with f4 and a mobile pawn mass here on the king side, which is well supported by the bishop on c4. And now bishop b5 check, and knight takes d4 is threatened, because bishop d7 would be forced. So a6 is played by Rubinstein, so knight g3, bishop d6, now f4, the aforementioned push, utilizing this is how white achieves his mobile pawn mass. Also very strong alternative here was queen g4, but we're trying to look at mobile pawn masses, so we'll go with this line. So castles, and now queen f3, king h8, bishop d2, f5, rook a e1, knight c6. Rubinstein is defending skillfully, but the e file will become very strong for white, as we'll see. So rook e2, queen c7. This is a slightly dubious move. Nimzowitsch felt the queen belonged on f6 instead, and that the best defense here was bishop d7 instead of queen c7. So e takes f5, e takes f5, and now a great move from Nimzowitsch. If you want to try and spot it, then stop the video now. Knight h1. How many of us would have considered this? The plan is to get the knight to g5, from where it will complement the c4 bishop, which has become a very powerful piece. In conjunction with control of the e-file, these factors give white an almost decisive edge already. So bishop d7, knight f2, rook a e8, rook f e1, rook takes e2, rook takes e2, knight d8, and not rook e8 or queen d5 is very strong. So knight d8, knight h3, bishop c6, queen h5, g6, queen h4, king g7, now queen f2. Rubinstein is defending well, and it became apparent to Nimzowitsch that there was no mating attack just yet. So instead he aims to force Rubinstein into a regrouping of his pieces. Queen takes d4 is threatened here. So bishop c5 to defend against queen d4. Now b4, bishop b6, queen h4, rook e8, rook e5, knight f7. Rook takes e5, hoping to win a pawn. Far too dangerous. Queen takes e5 would be a blunder. Queen h6 check. King h8, queen f8 is mate. So knight f7, bishop takes f7, queen takes f7, knight g5, queen g8. The queen has to also defend h7. And this also means that after rook takes e8, bishop takes e8 is forced. And now queen e1. And despite the limited material, black is now completely busted. He'll have to give up a piece to avoid getting mated. The game concluded bishop c6, queen e7 check, king h8, b5, queen g7, desperation. The point is, if a takes b5, knight e6 with a threat of queen f6 is crushing. For example, h5, queen f6 check, king h7, knight g5 check, king h6, bishop b4. And black will have to give up the queen after bishop f8 check. So this is the point, to free the square. Queen takes g7 check, king takes g7, and b takes c6. So obviously an easy win from here. So a very nice game from Nimzowitsch to illustrate some of the power that a mobile pawn mass can have. So Nimzowitsch had a lenient judgment on backward pawns in such cases, and it was his hope that it might come as some consolation to those readers dissatisfied with the idea of overprotection. His feeling was that players want to feel they can play whatever way they like, and that overprotection would sometimes seem pointless. Of course, this isn't the case, but it's easy to understand why some players would think so. So now we move on to the area where many amateurs and even masters often have great difficulty: the center. It should be known by everyone that it's necessary in certain positions to direct your pieces against your opponent's center. especially with white pawns on e4 and f4, whilst black has pawns on f7 and d6, or with white pawns on d4 and c4 against black pawns on e6 and c6. What is less appreciated is that keeping an eye on the center at all times is a strategic necessity, even in apparently closed positions. For example, in the chapter from part 1 on the pin, we saw the following opening: e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop c5, knight c3, knight f6, d3, d6, bishop g5, h6, bishop h4, g5, bishop g3. And what appears to be a closed position can actually transform very quickly. White has a couple of direct plans he can implement. Bishop b5 and d4, or knight d5 and c3 followed up with d4. This and most central play is the most direct and will almost always force your opponent to respond appropriately or face a very strong attack. Nimzowitsch likens the center to the Balkans, which were a strategically important geographic area in many conflicts. The center can also be seen as the high ground. Whoever takes it over in a conflict invariably has an advantage, everything else being equal. Another example of the same case happened in a game of Capablanca's against an R. Martinez in 1914. Capa with white opened with e4, and we saw a very similar line, e5, bishop c4, bishop c5, knight c3, knight f6, d3, knight c6, bishop g5, h6, bishop h4, g5, bishop g3, h5, h4, g4, queen d2, d6, knight g e2, queen e7, castles, and again the position appears to be closed, and as a result Martinez thought that this afforded him the luxury of playing a6, and had it been a genuinely closed position this would have been fine, but white can take action immediately now in the center with knight d5, opening things up right away, and this kind of opening up of the position is possible in the vast majority of closed center positions. Next came knight takes d5, e takes d5, knight d4, knight d4, bishop d4, c3, bishop b6, d4. And white, in Nimzowicz's view, already has a decisive advantage here. Play continued f6, rook a1, bishop d7, bishop f4, exploiting the pin, castles, bishop e3, rook d e8, g3, king b8, b4, bishop a4, bishop b3, queen d7, d takes e5, bishop takes e3, f takes e3, f takes e5, rook f6, bishop b3, a b3, rook e7, and in fact we've already studied this endgame closely in part 1, and it was very instructively played by Capablanca. But the point here is about the center and how it must be watched at all times. Should our opponent neglect the center, we should take action there immediately in order to exploit it, this game being a case in point. However, black can play the position differently in the opening to avoid the problems he experienced in the last example. After the moves e4, e5, bishop c4, bishop c5, knight c3, knight f6, d3, knight c6, bishop g5, h6, bishop h4, he can implement a different strategy. Instead of the risky g5 push to solve the problem of the pin, he can play instead d6, or even bishop e7, a much simpler approach. Alternatively, there's the more dynamic knight d4. For example, knight d5, g5, bishop g3, c6, knight f6, queen f6, c3, knight e6, h4, now d6, followed up with bishop d7, castling long, and maybe knight f4, and at least a comfortable game. So to go back to our initial game, d6 here. Knight d5 can still be met with g5, and after bishop g3, bishop e6, again with a comfortable game. And the immediate threat, if white does not address it, of a3, say for example if he just plays a bad move like a3, bishop d5, e takes d5, knight e7, bishop b5 checks c6, d takes c6, b takes c6, and black dominates the center. In all of these cases, it's of paramount importance to note that the knights on c3 and c6 are doing more than simply stopping our opponent from advancing with their d-pawn. It should be clear from these examples that they have the ability, the duty, to start an invasion of the center should our opponent permit any opportunity to do so. This is done through the moves knight d5 or knight d4, as we saw. Such a concession as to allow these moves occurs very frequently in amateur games, as they often have a preference for a premature switching of play to one of the flanks, thereby neglecting their central presence. Another kind of play that must be avoided is things like e4, e5, knight c3, knight f6, bishop c4, bishop c5, d3, knight c6, f4, d6, and now something like f5, because this takes the pressure off our opponent, and now he's free to carry out whatever he chooses. Instead of this move f5, knight f3 was best. After f5 is played, black can play knight d4 immediately, followed up with c6, b5, queen b6, and the d5 push, which, you know, is the move that f5 has made easier to play because it takes the pressure off e5, and making the d5 push easier. And you know, black's gonna have a powerful game after that in the center and on the queen side. So white's mistake here is again a change of front that neglects the center, which Nimzowitsch felt could not be emphasized enough as a diabolical yet commonplace mistake. He gave another example just to be absolutely sure that it was understood. So we see the same kind of opening as we saw a moment ago. Knight f3, d6, d4, knight f6, d takes e5, knight takes e4, bishop d3, knight c5, bishop f4, knight takes d3. Better, according to Nimzowitsch, was knight e6, attacking the bishop, followed up with d5, and this e6 knight becomes a very active and well-posted blockading piece. So knight takes d3, queen takes d3, knight c6, castles, bishop e7, e d6, bishop d6, bishop d6, queen d6, queen d6, c d6. And now, what to play as white? If you want to try and figure it out, stop the video now. Rook e1 check is what occurred in the game, but this was wrong. After bishop e6 came the classic amateur mistake, knight g5, the anti-positional and center neglecting change of front that Nimzowitsch had been referring to. Next came simply king d7, c3, and white's position is not particularly desirable. What he should have played instead of rook e1 check was knight c3, followed up with knight b5 to d4, centralizing with a superior game. He's going to have a knight firmly placed on d4, you know, forever. If this knight trades, then unless he's going to give up the exchange, he can never get rid of this knight on d4. So now we can look at an entire game to see how even strong players can underestimate the central strategy. This was played between Berntsson and Bajurulf in Sweden in 1920. So d4, d5, knight f3, knight f6, bishop f4, e6, c3, sorry, e3, c5, c3, and now the move b6, which in Nimzowicz's words is a classic mistake and played as though there is no central battleground. Better, in his opinion, is knight c6, where might follow knight bd2, bishop e7, h3, in case of knight h5, bishop d6, a lot of tempo, but this move, a loss of tempo, sorry, but this move h3 justifies it. So knight e5, bishop e5, d takes e5, knight d7, now knight f3, and a struggle is going to take place over the e5 square and pawn. Both players have conducted their play soundly and remained mindful of the center. Play might continue a6 to stop bishop b5, which would be a good positional move. So bishop d3 and now f6, and not, it should be noted, queen c7 attacking the pawn, or white simply castles with a comfortable game. Knight takes e5 is refuted with queen h5. Black's losing a piece here. F pawn is pinned, there's no other way to defend the knight. So f6, e takes f6, queen takes f6, just wins the e5 square, and that's more important and significant than playing to win the pawn itself. The winning of the square is the important thing. Black will be able to follow up by playing e5, and the immediate threat of e5, e4 gives black substantial initiative already. So we see why knight c6 was good, and now we can see why the move that Bajorov played, b6, was not as good. So b6, knight bd2, bishop d6, and now because black hasn't played knight c6, knight e5 is possible, exploiting the fact that he's neglected the center and rightly invading there immediately. So bishop e5, d takes e5, knight fd7, queen g4. And already it's clear that white's play has become direct and strong. So rook g8, knight f3, knight c6, bishop d3, now knight f8 to defend h7 from the bishop. So it's white to move. Thus far the opening is going well. He's won the e5 square at the very least. How and where should he continue with his play? If you want to figure it out, then stop the video now. Knight g5 is what Bernstein played, which is a strategic error that neglects the importance of the e5 square, which is the key to white's entire position. An attack should never be set up in a position that neglects the key point of our game, unless of course it's immediately winning. On the contrary, as we've seen, it's necessary instead to overprotect it. The correct way to play the position was with leaving the king side exactly as it was and taking action on the queen side instead with b4 and a4. For example, castling first of all, and after bishop b7, b4 and c4. Not c takes b4, c takes b4, knight takes b4, or bishop g5 attacks the queen and the knight. This is very problematic for black. So c4 would be better. Bishop c2, now say for example queen d7, a4, a6 is best. If instead castling long, a5, b takes a5, b5, and this attack is crushing. So a6, e4, castles long, bishop e3, king c7, a5, and white has a great attack here. After the text move, knight g5, black is getting immediate counterplay against the e5 pawn with queen c7. So bishop takes h7, rook h8, and bishop c2. So now is black to move. How should he continue? If you want to try and figure it out, then stop the video now. Bishop b7 was played in the game, but this was a mistake. He should seize the e5 square no matter how dangerous it seems, because there's nothing concrete for white at the moment. So knight takes e5. And you know, the pawn is only a bonus. As before, the square is the key factor. Play might continue queen g3, f6, knight f3, knight takes f3 check, queen takes f3, e5. And black has a great position. In terms of strategy thus far, black's move b6 neglected the center, and white became powerful there with knight e5, but then neglected the center in turn with knight g5. In particular, neglecting the e5 square, which could have lost his entire advantage if black had played correctly. So we can see how important the central play is here. So we'll go back to the main line. Bishop b7. So knight f3. And you know, from the sequence it's clear that white's approach was dubious. So g6, now bishop g5. White commits the same mistake again in neglecting his stronghold on e5. The bishop and the knight on f3 should have just stayed exactly where they were for the time being. So knight takes e5, but Jorolf didn't wait to be asked a third time. So knight takes e5, queen takes e5, h4. White once again neglects e5. Correct here was bishop f4, queen h5, queen g3, f6, bishop d6, and black's position is very shaky, if indeed it's even salvageable. After the game continuation, black can reach a position of complete safety, but not, however, in this manner. It's a game full of blunders, to be sure. You know, it's an amateur game, but it's instructive for the ideas that we're looking at. This move b5 not only loses time, it also weakens c5 and allows white a4 with active play. The correct continuation was knight d7. If bishop a4, for example, then f6, bishop f4, queen e4, attacking the bishop. So bishop b5, and now g5, or castling long, and black is doing just fine from here. But after b5, he's weakened himself badly. So white just castles. Now knight h7, bishop f4, queen h5, an exchange of queens. Now a4, and white is doing well, and Bernstein played well for the remainder of the game, at least in comparison to his previous play, winning as follows: bishop c6, bishop e5, f6, bishop d6, b takes a4. If instead c4, a b5, bishop b5, rook a5, followed up with bishop a4 and play on the a file. So bishop takes c5, king d7, bishop a4, a6. The bishops come off, and now rook a5, bishop b4. It's a dynamic play going on here. This a5 rook is active on the 5th rank. So rook b5, rook a1, takes, king b6, e4. This is the point of white's play. He wants to start mopping up pawns with his active rook. So rook d8, ed5, ed5, c4, d takes c4, rook takes h5, rook d7, and you know, with this 3-1 pawn majority, white is winning easily. So we're not really interested in studying the endgame too closely, but we just play it for the sake of curiosity. And at this point, black resigned. So, you know, despite the obvious mistakes, it was an instructive game that definitely illuminated the idea of the center. Black's early neglect of it handed white the advantage, which he promptly wasted, only for black to also miss his chance. As we saw, had either player utilized their opportunities better, it could have led to a decisive advantage. The morals to be taken from the game are: keep an eye on the center, overprotect, don't switch fronts prematurely, and after the central pawns disappear, pieces should replace them, as we saw in the earlier chapter on pawn chains. Okay, that's the end of part 2.